I had been looking forward to that hike for months. Summer in the Adirondacks always has a way of calling me back, even when I try to plan trips elsewhere. Something about those forests near Old Forge, New York, keeps pulling at me. The heavy pines, the damp soil underfoot, the smell of moss and wet leaves even in the heat of July. That morning I had set out early, eager to get a few miles in before the sun got too high. The plan wasn't anything ambitious, just a long loop I had mapped out from memory and trail markers, the kind of route that would take me in and out of some quieter areas where fewer people go. The trail was familiar, but even on familiar paths, the woods never feel exactly the same twice. The light was different that morning. It came down in long, pale beams through gaps in the trees, making the air look almost smoky. The ground was damp in patches, not from rain but from the kind of morning dew that seems to hang on well past sunrise in those shaded forests. I carried a small pack with the usual water, a snack, my knife, a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and bear spray just in case. I wasn't really thinking I'd need the spray. In all my years hiking there, I had only seen black bears from a distance, usually just a glimpse of their backsides disappearing into the trees. For the first few miles, it was peaceful. The only sounds were the scuff of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle from a squirrel or chipmunk darting across the trail. Every now and then a bird call carried from deeper in the trees, that hollow echo that only happens when you're far from open fields. I let myself get lost in the rhythm of it, step after step, breathing steady, arms swinging naturally. By late morning, the sun was climbing higher, and the air had warmed enough that I unzipped the front of my shirt a little. I had stopped for a drink of water, leaning against a mossy rock, when I noticed a faint smell drifting through the air. At first, I thought it was just the usual damp, earthy scent of the forest, mixed with pine resin. But there was something sour in it, sharp in a way that didn't quite belong. I figured it might be from something rotting nearby, a deer carcass maybe, or just wet leaves gone sour. I kept walking, though I noticed the smell got stronger in a particular stretch of trail. My steps slowed without me realizing it, my body already more alert than my mind was admitting. That's when I noticed the faint sound of metal clanging somewhere off to the left, deeper in the trees. I stopped. The sound carried oddly, muffled by the woods but still distinct. Metal against metal, irregular, like something shifting against a dumpster lid. That made me pause. Dumpsters aren't exactly a natural part of a hike. But then I remembered there was a service road not too far from that stretch, and sometimes old dumpsters were left near trailheads or cabins. It made sense. What I didn't expect was to step forward another 20 or 30 feet and suddenly freeze in place. There, not more than 30 feet ahead, was a black bear. He was big, much bigger than the ones I had glimpsed before. I'd put him at 250, maybe 300 pounds. Thick neck, fur that looked almost brown in the sunlight, though I knew better than to think he wasn't black. He was standing low at first, his head angled toward the side of the trail where I now noticed the edge of a dented dumpster half hidden behind brush. Clicked in my head instantly. He had been at the dumpster, digging for scraps. But then he turned his head toward me. There's a particular feeling when a wild animal really locks eyes with you. It isn't curiosity the way a dog or cat might look at you. It's assessment, cold, deliberate, and heavy. His face was only half visible under the shadow of the trees, but I could see the wet glint of his nose twitching as he scented the air. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my ribs. I knew black bears weren't usually aggressive. They'd rather avoid you if they can. But this one wasn't turning away. In fact, as I instinctively took a step back, I saw his body shift. Slowly, he rose up on his hind legs. The motion was too smooth, too deliberate, and it made him look even bigger than he already was. His chest lifted, fur stretched, front paws dangling in front of him. I had read about this, bears standing to get a better view, to sniff the air more clearly. But in that moment, all the knowledge in my head didn't matter. My body was screaming one thing, danger. I froze for a second too long. My throat was tight, my palms slick. Every instinct told me to run, but another part of me remembered every warning I had ever read. You don't run from a bear. You don't challenge it either. My only real thought was to make myself less of a threat and create distance. Slowly, carefully, I took a step backward. My boot landed on a dry stick that snapped loudly, echoing through the trees. The bear's head jerked at the sound, and my legs almost gave out under me. Another step back, then another. I kept my eyes on him, though every nerve screamed to look behind me to make sure I wasn't backing into a tree or rock. My breathing had gone shallow, short gasps I couldn't control. I felt like the air around me was tightening with every step. The bear shifted again, dropping back onto all fours, but instead of turning back to the dumpster, he stepped forward into the middle of the trail. His claws scraped against a stone as he walked, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. I couldn't tell if he was curious or if I had just interrupted his feeding, and now he was trying to decide what to do about it. Either way, he was between me and the trail ahead. My only option was to keep retreating. I must have backed away for nearly 50 yards before I dared slow down. My legs felt unsteady, rubbery, but I forced myself to keep control. I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, checking that the trail behind me stayed clear. When I looked back, the bear had turned slightly, his head angled once more toward the dumpster. Relief didn't wash over me immediately. I was still trembling, still waiting for him to decide I was worth following after all. My hand was already on the bear spray at my hip, fingers trembling so hard I doubted I could even pull the trigger if I needed to. For what felt like forever, I kept retreating. My eyes never left him. Finally, when I was far enough that the trees started to thicken and his shape grew smaller in the shadows, I let myself turn and walk faster. My steps were uneven at first, more like stumbles, but soon I was practically speed walking, forcing my breath to steady even though my heart hadn't calmed. The rest of the trail out was a blur. Every sound made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves in the underbrush made me snap my head around, expecting to see that bear following me silently. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt heavy, like every tree was hiding something that could step out at any second. By the time I reached the lot where my car was parked, my shirt was soaked with sweat, not from heat but from sheer adrenaline. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, and once I was inside, I just sat there with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The image of him standing there on his hind legs, towering above the trail, is something I'll never forget. It wasn't aggression, not exactly, but it was power. Pure, raw power that I had no control over. I was nothing out there compared to him. In the end, nothing happened. He didn't charge, he didn't follow me, he didn't hurt me. But that doesn't mean it wasn't one of the scariest moments of my life. It reminded me of just how small we really are in those woods, no matter how much gear we carry or how many times we've walked the trails. That hike could have ended badly, but it didn't. I was lucky. All I could do afterward was sit in that car, heart still pounding, and remind myself over and over again that black bears usually don't want trouble. But I'll tell you this, I've never walked those woods the same way since. I was camping alone on a beach a few years ago, and I can still remember every single detail of that night like it happened yesterday. I've spent plenty of nights in the woods, on trails, and near water by myself, but nothing else I've ever done compares to the fear I felt during those dark hours. It was the kind of fear that gets under your skin, makes your body freeze, and leaves a mark that doesn't really fade no matter how many years pass. The trip itself started out harmless. I had decided to take a break from the noise of life, from people and their constant rushing and talking, and I wanted to hear nothing but waves and wind. I chose a stretch of beach that was fairly isolated, where I knew there wouldn't be many visitors, especially since it wasn't summer season. It was a little tucked away, and you had to hike down through a wooded trail to reach it, which was exactly why I liked it. It felt cut off, like the rest of the world didn't exist once you got down there. I had a decent little two-person tent, a sleeping bag, and the basics packed. The sand was soft enough that I didn't even bother bringing a sleeping pad. I remember setting up my tent a little higher up from the shoreline, maybe 20 yards from the tide line, so I wouldn't wake up wet if the tide pushed up further than expected. From inside the tent, I could hear the ocean clearly, the crash and retreat of waves in a rhythm that always made me feel calm. It was exactly what I had come for. That evening went as expected. I walked up and down the beach, let the water wash over my feet, collected a few smooth stones, then sat and watched the horizon fade into dusk. There were no other people around, no boats that I could see, and no signs of footprints besides the ones I made myself. It felt like my own little world, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you've stepped outside of time. When darkness came, it was complete. Out there, with no artificial light nearby, the night wrapped around everything. The moon was just a thin sliver that didn't cast much glow, and the only light came from the faint stars overhead. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay on my back listening to the waves. The air was cool, but not uncomfortably cold, and I had no fire going because I didn't feel like I needed one. The sound of the surf was enough to drown out anything else. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight, but it didn't last long. At just after 3 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I thought it was the ocean that stirred me, but there was something different about the sound I heard. It was faint, something like fabric being brushed against, a soft dragging noise. I stayed still, trying to decide if it was just wind pushing against the tent. With the constant background of waves, it was hard to separate. I closed my eyes again, telling myself it was nothing, but just as I started drifting off, it happened again. The sound was closer, more deliberate. My body reacted before my mind did. I sat up, wide awake now, my heart already picking up speed. I held my breath and listened, and then it happened. The walls of the tent moved, not from wind, not from shifting air currents, but from something pressing in from the outside. One section of the tent bent inward, like a hand was pushing against it. Then another. I could see the shapes, the outlines of fingers spreading against the thin nylon, pressing hard enough to indent the fabric but not tearing it. On the opposite side, another push came, then another. Within seconds, all around me, the sides of the tent were caving in with pressure from multiple points. I froze, my body locked in place, as if moving would trigger something worse. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. The only thing I could hear besides the roar of the surf was the sound of the nylon fabric shifting under the pressure. No voices, no footsteps, no laughter, just silence and those pushing hands. It's hard to explain the kind of fear that takes over in a moment like that. It's not the kind of fear where you run or scream. It's the kind where your body refuses to do anything at all. I didn't even try to yell. Something in me said it would be useless anyway. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't care. I don't know how long it lasted. Couldn't have been more than 30 seconds, maybe less, but it felt stretched into hours. Every press of a hand against the tent wall felt like it was squeezing me tighter, like they were testing how far they could push. My mind raced through possibilities. Kids playing a prank, some stranger messing with me, or worse. I thought about the fact that I was alone. No one even knew I was out here, and if something happened, there was no help coming. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The pressure vanished. The fabric of the tent eased back into place. There were no sounds of retreat, no shuffle of feet in the sand, no voices whispering, just silence and the ocean. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. My ears strained for any hint of movement. Nothing. Finally, with hands that trembled more than I wanted to admit, I reached for my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to slip my head out, clicked on the beam, and swept it across the sand. What I saw made my stomach drop. Shoe prints, all around the tent. They weren't faint, wind-blown marks either. They were fresh, pressed deep into the sand in a full circle around me. Different directions, different angles, as if whoever was out there had walked around and around my tent, pressing in from every side. I counted at least a dozen distinct marks in the beam before I stopped. That moment is one of the clearest memories of my life. Standing there, my head poking out of the tent flap, flashlight in hand, surrounded by the evidence of someone's presence, but with no one visible in any direction. The beam of light reached only so far, and beyond that was just endless blackness and the sound of waves. I remember how exposed I felt, how small and helpless. I didn't go back to sleep. Couldn't. I sat inside the tent, light in hand, until the first gray signs of dawn began to show on the horizon. Every minute felt stretched thin, my body wired, my nerves frayed. At the smallest noise, I'd snap the light on and scan. Nothing ever showed. When morning finally came, I stepped out and examined the scene properly. The prints were everywhere, circling the tent, some overlapping, some leading off a few yards before fading into the harder sand closer to the tide line. There was no sign of who made them, no dropped items, no cigarette butts, no trash. Just the prints. Whoever it was, they had come, surrounded me, pressed their hands against my tent, and then left without a sound. I packed my things fast that morning. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't linger. I stuffed the tent into my pack, shouldered it, and walked back up the trail with my heart still beating hard. The whole hike back to my car, I couldn't shake the thought of how quietly they must have moved. Sand isn't a silent surface, yet I hadn't heard a single step. The only sounds had been the brushing against the nylon and the pressure of those hands. To this day, I don't know who it was. Maybe it was kids, like I tried to convince myself, though what kids are running around isolated beaches at 3 in the morning? Maybe it was someone looking to scare me, or maybe worse. Whatever the case, I've never been that scared in my life before or since. I've camped in bear country, I've heard coyotes circling at night, I've even had storms rip through the woods while I was in a tent, but nothing compared to the feeling of being targeted by people in the dark. The strange thing is, nothing actually happened to me. I wasn't hurt, nothing was stolen, I wasn't even directly confronted. But that's exactly what makes it worse. Whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. They wanted me awake, aware, and afraid. They didn't want anything else, at least not that night. And that's what has kept me up at night ever since, years later, the not knowing what they wanted or why they left when they did. I haven't camped alone on a beach since then. I probably never will. I had been in the woods countless times before that day, but I had never felt the kind of fear that crept into me on that climb. The woods had always been my place of calm, a place where my head could clear and where every step brought me deeper into silence. But that night, and that climb up the ridge, burned into me a different kind of memory, the kind that makes you feel exposed and fragile even though you've been in the woods your whole life. It started near the bottom of the ridge, where the slope began to rise steep and steady. The ground was damp with fallen leaves, pressed flat and slick from weeks of autumn rain, and the air hung heavy with the smell of wet earth. The ridge itself wasn't massive, maybe half a mile to 3/4 from bottom to top, but it was enough to make the lungs work and the legs burn. The trees there were thick, mostly hardwoods, with underbrush tangled between trunks, and the kind of silence that seems to stretch wider than the space itself. I had been making my way back toward camp after exploring down low by the creek. The water had been running cold and fast, swollen from rain, and the fading light made me decide it was best to head back up before dark caught me. I'd been out there enough times to know that climbing a ridge in the dark is an easy way to get turned around, and once the shadows fold together, it doesn't take long before everything looks the same. The first few steps uphill felt normal. The forest floor was soft, padded with years of leaf fall, and the occasional root caught my boot as I pushed upward. I stopped halfway to catch my breath and take in the view behind me. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a single sound, but a collection of them layered together. The sharp crack of a branch snapping under weight, the rush of something pushing through brush, the faint thud of steps too heavy to be a rabbit or a squirrel. I froze instantly, my chest tightening as the noise carried through the slope below me. It was deep, low, and unmistakably big. I stood there, listening hard. The woods that had been quiet just moments ago now seemed to echo with movement. My eyes darted down the slope, scanning for a shape, but the underbrush and low light blocked everything. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, and that was enough. I started moving again, slower this time, careful with every step. The ridge stretched above me, but all I could think about was what was down below. The sound hadn't gone away, it followed. Not steady, not constant, but enough. Every 20 or 30 steps, I'd stop, hold my breath, and listen. And every time I'd hear it again. A shift, a step, the muffled crash of weight pushing through the tangle of brush. It's hard to explain what it does to your head when you realize you're being followed in the woods. Every instinct kicks in at once. Your ears strain until they ache. Your eyes search shadows for shapes that aren't there. Your body feels both frozen and electric at the same time. The ridge that I'd hiked countless times before suddenly felt endless. I must have stopped a dozen times on that short stretch. Each time, I looked behind me, and each time the sound followed a moment later. Not close enough to see, but close enough to know it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Whatever it was, it had weight. It had intention. It was down there, keeping pace as I climbed. I thought about animals I'd seen before. Deer make noise when they move, but it's lighter, quicker, and usually gone in seconds. Bears can be heavy, but they tend to crash once and then fade, uninterested unless you've given them reason. This was different. This was deliberate, steady, and patient. It wasn't leaving. The climb stretched on forever. My shoulders ached from the weight of the pack, my thighs burned, and sweat trickled down my spine despite the cool air. Every time I forced myself to keep moving, the sound seemed to answer a moment later, like an echo that carried weight. The closer I got to the top, the worse the fear pressed in. The ridge narrowed, the trees thinned, and I knew the last stretch would leave me more exposed. The idea of reaching open ground with something still down below, something that had been following me step for step, made my stomach knot. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, the slope leveled. The ridge flattened into a narrow spine of earth, scattered with rocks and thin trees, and I could see the faint outline of sky breaking through branches above. I reached the top, heart racing, and turned around one last time. The woods below were dark, layered in shadows, thick enough that nothing moved visibly. But I stood there, frozen, staring down, waiting for something to step out. My ears strained, but the sound had stopped. Silence pressed heavy, thicker than before. I didn't know if it was still there, hiding just out of sight, or if it had melted back into the forest the way animals sometimes do. I waited longer than I probably needed to, standing there on the ridge, scanning, listening. The forest held still. No crack, no movement, nothing but the faint whistle of wind through branches high above. My hands were shaking as I finally turned and made my way along the ridge toward camp. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my bag, every sound magnified. The wind scraping against the tent, the faint drip of water from branches, the distant call of some bird. All of it kept my chest tight. I kept replaying the climb in my head, every stop, every turn, every sound that had followed me. When dawn finally came, relief washed over me in a way I can't explain. The light spread through the trees, chasing out the dark, and for the first time since I'd started up that ridge, I felt like I could breathe again. I stepped out of the tent, the air cold and damp, and I just stood there for a while, letting the sun hit my face. Later that morning, I walked back to the edge of the ridge and looked down. From the top, the slope looked different, less threatening, more ordinary. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. The distance might have only been half a mile, maybe 3/4, but in that short stretch I had stopped to listen and look behind me more than I had in my entire life of being in the woods. Every step had been loaded with tension, every pause filled with the weight of something unseen but undeniable. I never did see what followed me that night. Maybe it was a bear, curious but cautious. Maybe it was a moose moving through the same path, its massive weight carrying through the brush. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something I'll never know. What I do know is how it felt. How raw and real that fear was, how close the presence pressed without ever showing itself, how the climb stretched longer than any I'd ever done before. And when I think back on it now, what sticks with me isn't the silence at the top or the relief of sunrise. It's the in-between, the steady sound behind me, the pauses filled with dread, the way the woods themselves seemed to hold their breath as I climbed. It reminded me that no matter how familiar the woods feel, they'll always belong to something bigger, something older, and sometimes, all you can do is keep moving and hope the morning comes. I've always thought of black bears as the animal people worry about the most when they talk about the woods. Whenever someone asks if it's safe to camp or hike alone, that's the first thing they bring up, bears. But the truth is, black bears don't scare me nearly as much as moose do. Bears usually want nothing to do with you. They'll bluff, they'll huff, They'll sometimes push boundaries if you're careless with food, but they're predictable. Moose are not. They're huge, they're fast, they're territorial, and they don't care if you're in their way. If they decide to come at you, there isn't much you can do about it. I've read stories of people getting stomped, shredded, or tossed by their antlers, and it stuck with me in a way no bear encounter ever has. That thought was on my mind one autumn when I set out on a solo trip deep into the woods of northern country. The air had that sharp bite of fall, the kind that makes every breath feel crisp. The trees had started to change, bright yellows and reds against dark green pines, and the ground was covered in a layer of damp leaves. I wanted the silence, the isolation. I had packed light but enough for a week: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food sealed tight, and some basic protection. My plan was simple: hike in far enough that I wouldn't see another person, set up camp, and spend a few nights completely away from the noise of the world. The first few days went the way they usually do. Mornings were cold enough that I had to pull my jacket tighter as I boiled water for coffee, and nights came earlier than I expected, dropping fast into darkness once the sun dipped behind the trees. The forest was alive with the sound of leaves rustling, the creak of branches, and the sudden bursts of noise from squirrels or birds darting through the underbrush. I hiked during the day, moving from spot to spot, and by the second night, I was miles from the trailhead, in a place so quiet that even the wind seemed muted. I saw signs of moose here and there, big tracks pressed into the mud near a stream, piles of scat, the stripped branches of willows where they had fed. The size of the prints alone was enough to make me stop and stare. Each one looked like it belonged to something that shouldn't even exist in the same world as me. Dinner plate-sized impressions that sank deep into the earth, spaced so far apart I had to stretch my stride just to step from one to the next. I remember standing there, staring down, and imagining what it would feel like to have that kind of weight and power bearing down on me. That night, I set up camp on a patch of moss not far from those tracks. The spot was flat, ringed by tall spruce, and close enough to a small creek that I had water for cooking. I built a small fire and sat there as the light faded, listening to the distant crack of branches somewhere out in the dark. I told myself it was just deer or maybe another moose moving through. They were common here, and as long as I stayed out of their way, I should be fine. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of those massive tracks so close to where I lay. Sometime in the night, I woke to a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't the usual rustle of an animal or the snap of a twig. It was deep, steady, and heavy. Hooves, slow, deliberate steps pressing into the ground, each one sending a faint tremor through the earth. I lay still in my sleeping bag, my ears straining. The steps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the wet suck of mud pulling at hooves. The shadow of something massive moved across the faint glow of the tent wall. My breath caught. Even without seeing it fully, I knew what it was. No deer could cast a shadow that high. No bear moved with that kind of rhythm. This was bigger, much bigger. It stopped just a few feet from my tent. I could hear the sound of it breathing, a heavy, snorting exhale that misted the cold night air. For a moment, all I could think about was how thin the nylon wall was between us. A thin sheet of fabric was the only thing keeping me separated from 1,000 pounds of animal that could kill me without even meaning to. My chest felt tight and I didn't dare move a muscle. The moose shifted, hooves cracking twigs as it stepped to the side. I could hear its antlers brushing against branches, the wood snapping under the weight. It lingered there, close enough that I could smell it. A musky, earthy scent mixed with the dampness of the woods. My mind kept circling the same thought. If it decided to charge, I was finished. There was nowhere to go, no time to escape. Minutes passed like hours. Eventually, the moose moved off, crashing through the brush with a sound like a small tree snapping. I stayed frozen until the noise faded into the distance. When I finally sat up, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely unzip the bag. I didn't sleep again that night. I just sat there in the dark, waiting for every sound, jumping at the smallest creak of the trees. The morning light didn't bring much comfort. When I stepped outside, the ground was torn where the moose had stood. Hoof prints circled the tent, close enough that one of them nearly touched the guy line. I crouched there, staring at the depth of the impression, the size of it, and it hit me hard just how close I'd come. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. I tried to hike, tried to focus on moving forward, but my eyes kept scanning the trees, searching for any sign of that massive shape. Every shadow looked like antlers. Every crack of a branch made my heart leap. By evening, I was exhausted from the constant tension. I told myself it was just one encounter, that the chances of it happening again were small. But the woods felt different now. They didn't feel like they belonged to me. They felt like they belonged to the moose. That night was worse. I set up camp farther away from water, hoping to avoid them. But sometime past midnight, the sound returned. Not as close as before, but close enough that I could hear branches snapping, brush tearing, the deep grunts of an animal moving through. My imagination painted the picture. Huge antlers sweeping side to side, massive legs stomping the ground, dark eyes scanning for movement. I lay awake until dawn, certain that at any moment it would come crashing through. By the third day, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. The fear wasn't just passing through me. It had settled deep, twisting in my chest with every step I took. I didn't want to risk another night like that. I packed my gear and started back. My body sore and my nerves shot. The trail felt longer on the way out, every sound pulling my attention, every shadow looking like something about to step out. Hours later, when I finally saw the faint sign of the trailhead through the trees, the relief was so strong it felt like a weight lifting off me. I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until the forest finally opened up and I was back at the edge of civilization. Only then did I let myself breathe fully again. I've camped and hiked in plenty of places since then, and I've seen my share of animals, bears, coyotes, even wolves at a distance. But nothing has ever left the same mark on me as that encounter with the moose. It wasn't about aggression or malice. It was about sheer size, power, and unpredictability. A moose doesn't have to want to hurt you to kill you. All it has to do is be in the wrong place at the wrong time. That night in the woods reminded me that no matter how much experience you think you have, no matter how careful you are, there are things out there you can't control. A moose isn't like a bear or a wolf that you can read or react to. It's a force of nature, blind and heavy, and if it decides to move through you, you won't stand a chance. I walked out of those woods alive, but I'll never forget how it felt to lie in the dark. A thin wall of fabric separating me from something that could have ended me in seconds. Every time I zip up my tent now, I think about that moment, and the truth is, I'd take my chances with a black bear any day. At least with a bear, I'd know what I was up against. With a moose, you don't get that choice. You just hope it doesn't pick your path. I had been camping in the deep woods for a few days when it happened. I'd set out on this trip because I wanted to get away from everything. No roads, no people, no sound of cars, no sign of houses. Just trees, water, the sound of wind moving through branches, and the steady crackle of my campfire at night. I'd been hiking all day through thick forest, carrying my pack along narrow trails that had probably only been used by animals for years. By the time I found a place flat enough to pitch my tent, the light was already fading. I set up camp quickly, laid out my sleeping bag inside the tent, and got a small fire going before the forest turned completely black. That first night was quiet. I could hear owls somewhere far away and the occasional snap of a branch from an animal moving through the brush, but nothing close enough to worry me. I was used to the way the woods come alive at night, how every noise sounds louder when you're lying there in the dark, how your mind tries to put shapes and faces to shadows. I'd done enough solo trips to know most of it was harmless, and if I let myself relax, the sounds would blend together into a background hum that was actually kind of comforting. I slept well that night, tired from the long hike, and woke up early with the rising sun. The second day was much the same. Hiking, setting up a new spot a little deeper in, cooking a simple meal, and letting the silence of the woods settle around me. I wasn't worried about bears or wolves. I had my bear spray, I kept food sealed, and I'd done this before. Still, there's always a feeling when you're that deep out, when you know you're miles from anyone else, that you're in a place where you aren't really in control. Out there, you're just one more animal moving through the forest. The trees are bigger, the rivers are stronger, and the things that live there, moose, bear, whatever else, don't care that you came for peace and quiet. By the third night, I'd set up camp near a clearing not far from a small creek. The ground was soft with moss, and the trees around me rose so high that I could only see slivers of sky through their tops. I remember how still the air felt that evening. The fire smoke barely drifted at all, and the woods seemed heavy with silence, as if everything had paused. I cooked. I sat by the fire. I listened to the quiet. When I finally crawled into my tent, the night was dark, but calm. I zipped up the door, laid back in my bag, and let the small sounds of the woods lull me towards sleep. It was sometime in the middle of the night when it happened. I didn't know the exact time, but I knew it had been hours since I'd gone to bed. I was deep asleep when a noise jolted me awake. At first, it was just a heavy crack, with splintering, branches snapping. My mind tried to shake off the fog of sleep, and then the sound grew louder. It wasn't a single branch breaking. It was a storm of breaking wood, the sound of trees and brush being torn apart by something huge moving fast. It hit me all at once, like being shaken awake by the earth itself. It sounded like a freight train crashing through the woods, barreling straight through the trees. The ground shook under me as the sound came closer. My heart hammered instantly, and I froze in place, too shocked to even think of moving. I'd heard deer run before. I'd heard the crashing of smaller animals in the dark. This was not that. This was heavier, faster, louder. Before I could process what it was, the noise was on top of me. Something massive thundered past my tent, so close that I could hear its lungs pumping, the slap of hooves hitting the ground, the wild thrashing of branches being ripped aside. The walls of the tent quivered as the air seemed to push around me. It went past in a blur of sound and force, and for those few seconds I couldn't even breathe. I lay there, flat on my back, not daring to move, certain that at any moment the whole thing would crash down on me. Then, just as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The crashing moved off into the trees, fading quickly as whatever it was ran deeper into the night. Silence dropped heavy again, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I didn't move for a long time. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring into the dark ceiling of my tent, listening to every tiny sound that followed. A drip from a tree branch, the creak of the fabric as I shifted slightly, the sound of my own shallow breathing. My mind tried to catch up with what had happened. The sound, the size, the way the ground shook. I knew it could only be one thing. A moose. I had read before that moose don't have great eyesight, that they move more by instinct and sound. It made sense now. That huge animal had come barreling through the woods blind in the dark, and I had been lying in its path, a thin nylon wall separating me from being trampled by 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone. When I finally let myself breathe again, I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise, and listened. There was nothing. No more crashing, no more running, just stillness. I unzipped the sleeping bag, sat with my knees up, and waited. I don't think I slept again that night. Every snap of a twig made my chest tighten. I kept picturing what would have happened if that moose had been just a few feet to the side, if it had charged straight through instead of brushing past. The thought of being crushed in the dark, without even time to move, kept circling through my head. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside the tent. The air was cold, and the ground was damp with dew. The first thing I noticed was the mess in the clearing. Branches snapped clean, brush flattened, deep hoof prints pressed into the dirt just feet from where I had been sleeping. I followed them with my eyes, tracing the line of destruction past the tent and out into the trees. It had come so close, no more than 2 feet from where I lay. I walked slowly along the path it had taken, careful not to disturb the prints. The ground told the story clearly. The moose had come from one side of the clearing, running full speed, tearing straight through the brush. His tracks cut across, right past the tent, and then vanished deeper into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, realizing just how close I had come to being killed in my sleep by sheer chance. The rest of the morning, I felt shaken in a way I couldn't shake off. I tried to make breakfast, tried to calm down, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. They weren't calm or peaceful. They felt heavy, unpredictable, and dangerous in a way I hadn't felt before. I'd known there were risks coming out here alone, but until that night, it had all felt like something I could prepare for, something I could manage. Bears, weather, even injuries, I could plan for those. But the thought that a moose could just barrel through camp in the night, blind and unstoppable, missing me by a couple feet, that was different. That was chance. I spent that whole day thinking it over. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and hike back out, but another part of me stubbornly stayed. I told myself it had been a freak moment, that it was gone, that it wouldn't happen again. Still, I couldn't stop imagining it. The weight of it passing by, the sound of its hooves slamming the ground, the way the whole forest seemed to shake. I've been lucky, and I knew it. That night, when I lay down in the tent again, I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. Every sound put me on edge. When the wind picked up, I thought it was crashing again. When something small moved through the brush, I sat up straight, heart pounding. Sleep barely came, and when it did, it was shallow and broken. The next morning, I made the decision. I packed up my gear slowly, folding the tent, stuffing the sleeping bag, tying everything down. I stood for a while in that clearing, looking at the place where the tracks had been, and I felt a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that I was alive, that I hadn't been in the direct path. Fear at knowing how close it had been, how little control I had in that moment. The hike back out was long and quiet. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see another shape moving through them. The woods still looked beautiful, still smelled of pine and earth, still felt endless, but the peace I had come for was gone. All I could think of was how thin the line had been between waking up that morning and not waking up at all. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, my legs were tired and my pack heavy, but the relief that washed over me was stronger than anything else. I had wanted solitude, I had wanted quiet, but what I got instead was a reminder of just how unforgiving the deep woods can be. Out there, you aren't in charge. Out there, things bigger than you move in the night without warning, and sometimes your life comes down to nothing more than whether they miss you by a few feet. That was the closest I had ever come to death in the woods, and it wasn't from a predator or a storm. It was from a moose, blind in the dark, charging through the trees like a freight train. I'll never forget the sound of it, the way the ground shook, or how fragile the thin walls of my tent felt as it passed. It left me with a respect I can't shake, a memory that replays every time I zip up a tent and lie down alone in the forest. I know now that sometimes survival isn't about skill or preparation. It's about chance. That night, chance was on my side, and that's the only reason I walked out of those woods alive.